David Jackson was no stranger to struggle. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta, his life had been a continuous battle against systemic barriers, economic hardships, and the quiet but persistent weight of being underestimated. David's childhood was marked by an insatiable curiosity for the world around him. His mother, a nurse who worked long hours, often left him with stacks of paper and crayons to keep him entertained. What began as a pastime quickly became a passion. By the age of 10, David was sketching portraits of his neighbors, capturing their essence with a precision that belied his years. But talent alone could not shield David from the realities of his circumstances. The lack of resources in his local schools meant he had to teach himself much of what he wanted to learn about art. He would spend hours at the public library, poring over books about Impressionism, Surrealism, and abstract art, mesmerized by the works of artists like Basquiat and Jacob Lawrence. Yet, in a society that often undervalued both art and black talent, David's dreams of becoming a renowned artist seemed more like fantasies than achievable goals. Early rejection. David's big break, or so he thought, came one rainy afternoon when he managed to scrape together a modest portfolio of his best works. Armed with a few canvases and a hopeful heart, he walked into Whitman and Company, one of Atlanta's most prestigious art galleries. The gallery, owned by Edward Whitman, catered exclusively to high-end clientele and boasted a reputation for showcasing only elite artists. David had spent weeks mustering the courage to approach Whitman. He'd meticulously selected his best pieces, a vibrant abstract painting inspired by the civil rights movement, a hauntingly beautiful portrait of his mother, and a bold, surrealist piece that explored themes of identity and resilience. He believed his art spoke to universal truths, emotions that transcended race or class. When David entered the gallery, his presence immediately drew judgmental glances from the staff. Dressed in his second-hand blazer and carrying a battered portfolio case, he stood out among the wealthy patrons adorned in designer suits and couture dresses. The polished, white marble floors and gleaming glass displays seemed to mock his modest appearance. Edward Whitman, a man in his late 50s, with a sharp jawline and an even sharper tongue, approached David with a forced smile. "Yes?" Edward asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'd like to show you my work," David said, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. Whitman's eyes scanned David from head to toe, lingering briefly on his worn shoes. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I thought you could just walk in here?" Edward interrupted, his smile now replaced with a smirk. He gestured around the gallery. "This isn't a charity. We represent serious artists, people with pedigree and connections." David tried to explain, to show his work, but Edward didn't bother looking at the portfolio. Instead, he waved dismissively and said, "We don't have time for amateurs. Maybe try the community center down the street." The laughter of a nearby patron only deepened David's humiliation. As David left the gallery, the sting of rejection burned deeper than he'd expected. It wasn't just the dismissal of his art, it was the way Edward had looked through him, as if he were invisible, as if he didn't belong. But beneath the hurt was a spark of determination. If the world didn't see his worth, he would make them see it. Inspiration amidst adversity. That night, David worked furiously in his small studio apartment. The space was cramped, with canvases leaning against the walls and paint tubes scattered across the floor. The rejection had ignited something within him, a fire he hadn't felt before. His brushstrokes were bolder, more defiant. Each piece he created over the following weeks carried the weight of his emotions, anger, sadness, hope, and an unyielding belief in his own potential. One piece, in particular, stood out. It was a sprawling canvas filled with fragmented images of his journey, his mother's weary hands, the graffiti-lined walls of his neighborhood, and a shadowy figure walking alone under a streetlight. It was raw, honest, and unapologetically him. David began to see rejection not as a wall, but as a stepping stone. He attended local art fairs and community events, displaying his work wherever he could find a willing audience. Though the sales were minimal, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. People connected with his art, seeing their own stories reflected in his vibrant colors and layered textures. Discovery by an advocate. It was at one of these community events that David's fortunes began to change. Angela Reed, a well-respected art critic known for her keen eye and advocacy for emerging talent, stumbled upon his booth. She was immediately drawn to one of his pieces, a hauntingly beautiful depiction of a young boy staring at a fractured mirror. "Who's the artist?" she asked, scanning the modest setup. David stepped forward, hesitant but hopeful. "That would be me." Angela spent nearly an hour studying his work, asking questions about his inspirations and techniques. Unlike Edward, she saw beyond the surface. She saw the raw talent, the unique perspective, and the stories David's art told. "You have something special," Angela said, her voice filled with conviction. "The world needs to see this." Within weeks, Angela had written a glowing feature about David in a prominent art magazine. She introduced him to collectors, gallery owners, and fellow artists who shared her enthusiasm for his work. For the first time in his life, David felt seen, not just as a black artist, but as an artist, period. Foreshadowing. As David's reputation began to grow, so did his confidence. But he never forgot the sting of Edward Whitman's words or the humiliation he'd felt in that gallery. While he channeled most of his energy into creating and sharing his art, a small part of him couldn't help but imagine the day he would walk back into Whitman and Company under very different circumstances. Unbeknownst to Edward, the young artist he had mocked and dismissed was on the verge of becoming a force to be reckoned with in the art world. David's story was just beginning, and it was a story that would soon be impossible to ignore. A viral breakthrough. David Jackson's life changed one evening in a way he could never have anticipated. After months of tireless work, his art caught the eye of Jasmine Moore, a prominent social media influencer with millions of followers. Jasmine was known for championing underappreciated talent, and during a casual visit to a local art fair, she stumbled upon one of David's pieces, a bold, kaleidoscopic painting that depicted the resilience of his neighborhood. The piece stopped her in her tracks. Without hesitation, she snapped a picture in front of the painting, her caption reading, "Art that speaks to the soul. Meet David Jackson, an artist the world needs to know about." Jasmine's post took on a life of its own. Within hours, the image was shared across platforms, gaining likes, comments, and attention from art enthusiasts, collectors, and media outlets. By morning, David woke up to a flood of messages on his website and social media accounts. His work had struck a chord. "Where can I buy this? This artist is incredible, his story needs to be heard. David Jackson might be the next big name in art." The orders poured in, and inquiries about his availability for exhibitions skyrocketed. David, who had spent years struggling to sell a single painting, suddenly found himself unable to keep up with the demand. His modest studio became a whirlwind of activity as he worked day and night to fulfill commissions and prepare for the opportunities now coming his way. Media buzz. Jasmine's post was only the beginning. Within weeks, David was featured in online articles, interviewed for podcasts, and showcased in art blogs. His unique style, an emotional blend of abstract and realism, captured a broad audience. Critics praised his ability to evoke profound emotion through his work, and collectors admired the raw honesty embedded in each brushstroke. Major outlets soon followed suit. A local news segment on rising stars in the art world featured David, where he candidly shared his story of perseverance and rejection. The segment not only amplified his reach, but also humanized him, turning his name into a symbol of hope and resilience. Angela Reed, the art critic who had championed David from the start, smiled as she watched his rise. "It was only a matter of time," she said in one interview. "David's art is a mirror to society, it's impossible to look away." By now, David's paintings were fetching tens of thousands of dollars, a fact that still felt surreal to him. He often found himself reflecting on the days when he could barely afford a decent canvas. Edward's ignorance. As David's name spread like wildfire through the art community, Edward Whitman remained blissfully unaware. Despite the buzz surrounding David's work, Edward, ever the elitist, paid little attention to new talent unless it came through his carefully curated circle. To Edward, the world of serious art was exclusive, reserved for pedigreed names and those who could afford to maintain their status through connections and wealth. He had no idea that the young man he had dismissed as irrelevant was now making waves that threatened to overshadow his entire gallery. When an assistant at Whitman and Company mentioned David's name during a casual conversation about rising stars, Edward waved it off. Another social media sensation, he scoffed. They're all the rage these days, but let's see if he lasts a season. Real art isn't about trends, it's about legacy. Little did Edward know, David was not just creating art, he was creating a movement. David's growing confidence. For David, the sudden fame and fortune brought not only opportunities, but also a sense of validation. Yet, in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the memory of Edward's condescending smirk and dismissive words. It wasn't about revenge, David reminded himself, it was about proving a point. Arrogance, he told Angela one day, is a dangerous thing. It blinds people to the truth, to potential, to possibility. I want to remind people like Edward that greatness doesn't come in one shape, color, or background. As his confidence grew, so did his ambitions. David began to think strategically about how he could use his newfound platform to create lasting change. He started planning for a moment when he could confront Edward, not with anger, but with a statement that would resonate far beyond the art world. David's success allowed him to quietly expand his influence. With Angela's guidance, he began investing in smaller galleries and supporting underrepresented artists. His dream was to create a space where talent, not pedigree, was the currency of success. An exclusive invitation. The turning point came when David received an email from the organizers of the prestigious Horizon Art Gala, one of the most renowned exhibitions in the country. The gala, known for launching the careers of countless iconic artists, had selected David as one of their headliners. The invitation felt surreal. David's name was now listed alongside some of the biggest figures in contemporary art. The gala would be held at a sprawling venue in downtown Atlanta, with collectors, critics, and celebrities in attendance. But there was one detail that caught David's eye: Edward Whitman's gallery was one of the event's sponsors. Angela, upon hearing this, couldn't hide her excitement. "This is it," she said. "Your chance to show him who you are now." David nodded, though his expression remained calm. "It's not about showing him who I am," he replied. "It's about showing him who he could have supported. That's the real lesson." With weeks to prepare, David poured himself into creating a series of pieces for the gala. Each work told a piece of his story, his struggles, his resilience, and his vision for a more inclusive art world. He titled the collection Shattered Perspectives, a nod to the barriers he had broken and the distorted views of those who doubted him. As the date of the gala approached, David couldn't help but anticipate the moment he would step into the venue, not as the struggling artist dismissed by Edward, but as a celebrated headliner with the world watching. What Edward would make of it all remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: the stage was set for a dramatic reunion that neither of them would forget. The gallery set up. David Jackson's rise to fame brought not only wealth, but also an opportunity to effect change in an industry notorious for its gatekeeping. As his reputation soared, he began to research ways to dismantle the very barriers that had stifled him for so long. The idea struck him while reading an article about failing art galleries and how ownership structures could influence artistic representation. Edward Whitman's gallery was, ironically, struggling behind the scenes. While its front-facing image remained pristine, the gallery had faced declining revenue due to its rigid exclusivity and lack of adaptation to the digital age. David's assistant, an astute business strategist, unearthed this information and presented it to him. "Whitman and Company is vulnerable," she said. "They're trying to secure additional funding to stay afloat." The revelation was all David needed. Using a network of silent investors and his newfound resources, he quietly purchased a controlling share of Whitman and Company, ensuring that Edward would remain unaware of the gallery's change in ownership, at least for now. His plan wasn't about revenge, but about creating a teachable moment. David made subtle but impactful changes behind the scenes. He revised the gallery's contracts to include commitments to showcasing emerging and underrepresented artists. He allocated funds to renovate the gallery's neglected spaces and prepared for an unveiling that would highlight the transformation. The reunion. The day of the unveiling was set. David decided to visit the gallery incognito a few days before the event to assess how things were running. Dressed in a casual hoodie and jeans, he strolled into Whitman and Company, his presence once again drawing skeptical glances from the staff. Edward Whitman was at the counter, engaged in conversation with a potential client. The older man's voice carried the same air of superiority David remembered vividly. When Edward noticed David approaching, his expression shifted to one of irritation. "Excuse me," Edward said curtly, stepping away from the client. "Can I help you?" David offered a polite smile. "I was just admiring the space. It looks like you've made some updates." Edward, eyeing David's attire, barely concealed his disdain. "Updates? Hardly. We've maintained our standards, unlike some of the more transient galleries in the city." David nodded, undeterred. "That's interesting. I heard this place recently underwent new management." Edward scoffed. "Management? No, I'm still very much in charge here. Whatever you've heard, I assure you, this gallery has always been my vision and my creation." David suppressed a grin. "Good to know." As David turned to leave, Edward muttered loudly enough for him to hear, "Another dreamer wasting my time." David paused at the door, but chose not to respond. He knew the real impact would come soon enough. The big reveal. The evening of the gallery's unveiling arrived, and the space was packed with influential collectors, critics, and artists. The event was billed as a showcase of the gallery's new era, though Edward still had no idea just how new it was. Edward, as always, was in his element, mingling with guests and boasting about the gallery's legacy. When the time came for the keynote speech, he stepped up to the microphone, prepared to deliver his usual rhetoric about exclusivity and excellence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edward began, "tonight we celebrate the enduring legacy of Whitman and Company, a beacon of artistic brilliance, and..." He was interrupted by the event organizer, who leaned in to whisper something in his ear. Edward's face froze. I've just been informed," he said, attempting to mask his confusion, "that our new investor would like to say a few words. Please welcome Mr. David Jackson." The room erupted in applause, though the name clearly didn't register with Edward until David walked onto the stage. His eyes widened as the man he had dismissed twice now stood before him, commanding the attention of the crowd. David took the microphone, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Edward's growing discomfort. "Good evening, everyone," David began, his voice steady and confident. "It's an honor to stand here tonight, not just as an artist, but as someone who believes in the transformative power of art." He glanced at Edward, whose face was now a mix of shock and embarrassment. "You see, this gallery has played an interesting role in my journey," David continued. "Years ago, I walked through these doors with nothing but a portfolio and a dream. I was turned away, dismissed, in fact. But that rejection became my fuel, my inspiration. It reminded me that art is not just for the privileged few. It's for everyone." The audience, captivated, erupted in applause. "And now," David said, pausing for effect, "as the new majority owner of Whitman and Company, I'm here to ensure that this gallery reflects that belief." Public humiliation. The crowd gasped, their attention shifting to Edward, who looked as though the floor might swallow him whole. Whispers spread through the room as guests began to connect the dots. David, sensing the tension, gestured toward Edward. "Mr. Whitman," he said, his tone measured but firm, "I want to thank you. If it weren't for your dismissal, I might not have pushed myself as hard as I did. You helped me see the gaps in this industry, gaps I intend to fill." The room applauded again, though this time there was an undertone of unease. Edward, visibly flustered, attempted to salvage his dignity. This is highly irregular," he stammered. "I had no idea." "No, you didn't," David interrupted, his voice calm but resolute. "And that's the problem. You didn't bother to look beyond the surface, to see potential where others might see nothing. That's a lesson I hope we all take from tonight." The audience murmured in agreement, their admiration for David's poise clear. Edward's reputation, built on his supposed ability to spot and nurture talent, was now in tatters. David's message. As the night continued, David used the opportunity to unveil his vision for the gallery. He announced new initiatives to support emerging artists, scholarships for underrepresented talent, and partnerships with community organizations. "This gallery," David said, his voice filled with conviction, "will no longer be a fortress of exclusivity. It will be a platform for those who have stories to tell, regardless of where they come from." By the end of the evening, David had not only solidified his place as a leader in the art world but also delivered a powerful message about perseverance and respect. Edward, now a symbol of outdated elitism, was left to grapple with the consequences of his arrogance. As David left the gallery that night, he felt a sense of closure. He had turned rejection into triumph and used his success to create opportunities for others. The moment was not just a personal victory but a statement to the world: greatness knows no boundaries. Edward's fall. The fallout from the gala was swift and unforgiving for Edward Whitman. The art world, already teetering on the edge of change, saw his humiliation as a symbol of a shifting tide. Once regarded as a gatekeeper of prestige, Edward now found himself at the center of scathing critiques and public scrutiny. Articles with headlines like "When Arrogance Meets Accountability" and "The Fall of Whitman: Lessons in Hubris" flooded art blogs and mainstream media alike. The patrons who had once flocked to Edward's gallery began to distance themselves, wary of being associated with his outdated and elitist practices. Even some of his closest allies in the industry turned their backs, quietly withdrawing their support to avoid being caught in the storm. Edward tried to spin the narrative in his favor, giving interviews where he claimed the incident was a misunderstanding and praised David's talent. But the public wasn't buying it. The video clips of his condescending remarks at the gala had gone viral, cementing him as the face of a crumbling hierarchy. "Edward Whitman represents everything wrong with the art world," one prominent critic wrote. "For too long, people like him have stifled creativity in favor of exclusivity." David Jackson's rise is not just a victory for one artist, it's a wake-up call for the entire industry. Edward's gallery, once a thriving hub for high-profile collectors, now struggled to draw an audience. His remaining clients began canceling exhibitions, and his name became a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of art institutions. David's rise. While Edward's reputation crumbled, David Jackson's star continued to soar. His decision to purchase Whitman & Company and transform it into a beacon of inclusivity proved to be a masterstroke. The gallery, renamed the Jackson Collective, became a hub for emerging and underrepresented artists from all walks of life. David implemented programs that broke down traditional barriers in the art world. Monthly showcases featured artists from diverse backgrounds, and the gallery hosted workshops and mentorship programs for aspiring creatives. Scholarships were established in David's name, providing resources for young artists who, like him, had faced systemic obstacles. The gallery's transformation attracted widespread attention. Influential collectors and critics, drawn by David's authenticity and vision, began frequenting the space. The Jackson Collective quickly gained a reputation as a place where art wasn't just displayed but celebrated for its ability to tell stories, challenge norms, and inspire change. David's personal life flourished as well. He found a balance between creating his own work and supporting others. His pieces continued to command top-dollar prices, but his focus remained on using his platform to amplify the voices of others. "I've achieved more than I ever dreamed," David said in an interview with the New York Times. "But my greatest accomplishment is knowing that I'm paving the way for others to dream even bigger." Community impact. The Jackson Collective became more than just a gallery, it became a cultural landmark. Located in the heart of Atlanta, it drew visitors from around the world. Tourists, students, and local residents alike flocked to the space, eager to experience the vibrant energy that had redefined the city's art scene. The gallery's success inspired similar initiatives in other cities, sparking a broader movement to make the art world more inclusive. David often traveled to speak at conferences and collaborate with other artists and institutions, sharing the lessons he had learned along his journey. One of the most impactful changes was the sense of pride and belonging the gallery instilled in the local community. For many young artists, seeing someone who looked like them at the helm of such a prominent institution was a transformative experience. "David Jackson gave me hope," said one teenage artist during a community event. "He showed me that my story matters, and that art is for all of us, not just a chosen few." A reflective moment. Late one evening, after the gallery had closed, David found himself alone in the main exhibition hall. The space was quiet, the walls adorned with a mix of his own work and pieces from emerging artists he had mentored. He walked slowly, taking in the culmination of years of struggle, rejection, and triumph. Standing before one of his earliest paintings, a piece he had created during the darkest period of his life, David felt a wave of emotion. He remembered the countless nights spent doubting himself, the humiliation of being dismissed, and the relentless drive that had pushed him forward. "I've come full circle," he thought, his voice barely a whisper. In that moment, he felt a profound sense of peace. He wasn't just an artist anymore, he was a changemaker, someone who had reshaped the industry that had once tried to keep him out. As he gazed at the painting, his mind wandered to Edward Whitman. Despite everything, David couldn't help but wonder how Edward was faring. The older man had been many things, arrogant, dismissive, even cruel, but he was also human. Foreshadowing the final resolution. David's thoughts lingered on the idea of reconciliation. He had built his success on a foundation of resilience and hope, not bitterness. While Edward had been a catalyst for his transformation, David knew the journey was never about revenge. "I didn't just want to succeed," David mused. "I wanted to change things. And change doesn't happen through division, it happens through understanding." With that thought, he began to consider an unexpected gesture. Perhaps it was time to reach out to Edward, not to gloat or demand an apology, but to offer something far more powerful, a second chance. David smiled faintly as he turned off the gallery lights. The future was unwritten, but one thing was certain: his story, and the stories of those he championed, were far from over. An apology. Months had passed since the gala, and Edward Whitman found himself grappling with an unfamiliar reality: irrelevance. His once prestigious name had become synonymous with arrogance and elitism, and the doors that had always been open to him were now firmly closed. The silence was deafening, but it gave him something he had avoided for years: time to reflect. Edward had spent most of his life believing that his position in the art world was unassailable. He had built his career on the assumption that he alone could define what art was worth celebrating. Yet, David Jackson's meteoric rise and the public revelation of Edward's behavior had shattered that illusion. One rainy afternoon, Edward stood outside the Jackson Collective, hesitating. His once pristine tailored suit now hung slightly loose on his frame, a reflection of the toll the past months had taken on him. With a deep breath, he stepped inside, clutching a folder filled with carefully written notes and sketches. The gallery was alive with energy, filled with visitors admiring the latest exhibit. Edward spotted David near the center of the room, speaking warmly with a young artist. David's demeanor exuded confidence, but his smile was genuine, and his focus on the artist before him was unwavering. Gathering his courage, Edward approached. David noticed him immediately, his expression flickering between surprise and cautious curiosity. "David," Edward began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "May I speak with you for a moment?" David nodded, gesturing for them to step into a quieter corner of the gallery. "I owe you an apology," Edward said, his voice trembling slightly. "Not just for how I treated you when you first came here, but for everything I represented. I was blind to your talent, your worth, and the damage my arrogance caused. I was wrong." David studied Edward, searching for any hint of insincerity. Instead, he saw a man who, for the first time, seemed genuinely humbled. "I don't expect forgiveness," Edward continued. "But I want you to know that I've spent these months reflecting on my actions, on the harm I caused not just to you but to countless others. I've lost everything, and honestly, I deserve to. But if there's any way I can make things right, I want to try. A second chance." David remained silent for a long moment, his mind racing. Edward's words seemed genuine, but could a man who had spent decades embodying everything wrong with the art world truly change? "I'll admit," David said finally, "I wasn't expecting this. You've done a lot of damage, Edward, not just to me, but to so many others who deserved a chance." Edward nodded solemnly. "I know. And I can't undo the past. But if there's even a small way I can help now, I want to try." David sighed, torn between skepticism and his belief in redemption. Finally, he said, "I believe people can change, Edward. If you're serious about making amends, I might have a way for you to start." Edward's eyes widened slightly. "Anything. Just tell me what I need to do." David leaned forward. "I'll give you a chance to work here at the gallery, under my leadership. You'll help curate exhibitions, but this time, your focus will be on amplifying the voices you once ignored. This isn't about you, it's about the artists who deserve a platform. Can you handle that?" Edward's voice was firm, almost desperate. "Yes. I'll do whatever it takes." A symbolic gesture. David wasted no time putting Edward's commitment to the test. His first task was to curate an exhibition featuring works from underrepresented artists, many of whom had never been showcased in a gallery before. The theme of the exhibition was rebirth, a reflection of growth, transformation, and second chances. Edward threw himself into the project with a fervor David hadn't expected. He visited community art spaces, attended grassroots events, and spoke with artists whose stories deeply moved him. For the first time in his career, Edward wasn't focused on maintaining an image or impressing wealthy patrons. Instead, he was listening, learning, and genuinely investing in the artists and their work. The exhibition was a resounding success. On opening night, the gallery was filled with visitors from all walks of life. The walls were adorned with pieces that spoke to resilience, diversity, and hope. Edward stood in the background, quietly observing as the artists received the recognition they had long deserved. At one point, a young artist approached him. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice tentative, "I just wanted to thank you. This is the first time my work has ever been shown in a gallery, and it means the world to me." Edward felt a lump in his throat as he responded. "No, thank you, for trusting me with your story." David's lasting legacy. The success of the Rebirth exhibition solidified the Jackson Collective as a revolutionary force in the art world. David's vision of an inclusive, community-focused space had become a reality, and the impact was felt far beyond Atlanta. Similar galleries began adopting his model, prioritizing underrepresented artists and fostering creativity without barriers. David, now regarded as a trailblazer and cultural icon, remained grounded. He continued to mentor young artists, collaborate with other galleries, and use his platform to advocate for systemic change in the industry. His legacy wasn't just about his own work, it was about the countless lives he had touched and the doors he had opened for others. Final message. One evening, after the gallery had closed, David and Edward found themselves sitting together in the quiet exhibition hall. The walls were adorned with pieces from the Rebirth collection, each one a testament to the power of perseverance and transformation. "You know," David said, breaking the silence, "I never imagined we'd end up here." Edward nodded. "Neither did I. But I'm grateful we did." David turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "People always talk about the power of art to change the world. I think it's true, but only if we let it change us first." Edward smiled faintly. "You're right. And I'm proof of that." As they sat there, surrounded by the vibrant energy of the gallery, David felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had turned his pain into purpose, his rejection into revolution. And in doing so, he had not only changed his own life, but had also transformed an entire industry. The story of David Jackson and the Jackson Collective became a legend, a reminder that greatness can rise from the most humble beginnings, and that even the most broken systems can be rebuilt, one piece of art at a time.